Hi, I'm Harrison-Plastow. Welcome to this video. This is going to be a real quick one. I want to get an idea down before I forget. This whole video is going to be exploring the relationship between our beliefs, narratives, emotional needs, and our behaviour, but with a very strong focus on explaining and understanding the metacrisis and where that's come from. And then hopefully that'll give us some things to think about. But more than anything, what I'm trying to get across is a way of looking at things and a way of thinking that could be quite helpful for dealing with some of these big ideas when we look at our behaviour, when we look at the world and we go, oh, metacrisis, why? What is going on? So yeah, let's just get straight into it. The idea that I want to convey here, first of all, is in lots of the videos that I make. It's around this idea of this empathy framework about understanding how we make sense of the world, how those interpretations are based on perception, and the meanings that we create about the world. Then create emotional responses. Those emotional responses relate to a set of emotional needs. You can choose whichever set you want. I like to use a set from Marshall Rosenberg and nonviolent communication, which in turn were taken from the work of the economist Manfred Max Neef and his universal human needs, but we want to look at them as Marshall Rosenberg did in terms of emotional needs. And it works like this. Our beliefs are the larger set of our patterns, the way that we encode reality in the first place. In a neuroscience kind of way of thinking, it's the model that we've created of reality through perception. And that's been laid down from birth, and we're inheriting all sorts of patterns as well. We pass on patterns, we create new patterns. It's our education, it's our lived experience, it's everything that we've taken on board in terms of mapping and understanding reality in order to survive and make sense of the world. It's what we believe to be true, it's what we take as reality. But of course, just like a map is not the territory, our beliefs are not reality, they are beliefs about reality. It's just we take them to be reality, which is why we're in a lot of the problems that we're currently in at the moment. Those beliefs and those patterns, we then view the world through them to encode them and make sense of them. And in the making of meaning, we tie together events through story, through narrative. That's how we process data as encoded through our beliefs into sequence, cause and effect, relationship. We make sense of things through narrative. Those narratives then create emotional responses in us because they lead us to perceive whether or not our set of 7 emotional needs are being met. If we perceive that they are being met, we experience positive emotion. And if we perceive that they are not being met, then we experience negative emotion. And all behaviour then becomes a product of all of that above because we're constantly trying to have our needs met. We want our emotional needs. We want that wholeness and that integrity of all of those needs being met. That's our supreme state. It's driving all of our behaviour. It's keeping us alive and it's making us human. Another way to think about this is think of lenses of belief through which we see the world. We tell ourselves stories about it, and then we have emotional responses to that, and that drives our behaviour. There's a whole thing here about physiology, but I won't go into that just yet. And obviously, we're not only looking at things in a linear fashion one way, we are projecting. So those patterns that we have get projected onto the world, and that's how we're making sense of them. It's in us, but then we see it out in the world and we think it's out there, but it's not. It's in us. It's in the lenses through which we're seeing. So we're projecting all of this. We're not just perceiving. And then finally, if you want to get super geeky about it, you can think about it like behavior is a function of our emotional need states as determined by our narratives and our beliefs. Okay, so all of this is to say, right, if that's a useful way of thinking, what are the beliefs, what are the stories, and what are the unmet needs that give rise to the metacrisis? Okay, so the metacrisis is this idea of like all of these different separate challenges and crises that we see in the world, whether that's climate change or economic uncertainties and late stage capitalism, social injustice, so many different things going on in our ways of thinking. What are the beliefs, what are the stories, and what are the unmet needs that give rise to it? Writers like Charles Eisenstein and many others, and obviously wisdom traditions and indigenous cultures for the longest time have been saying that the problem at the heart of Western ideology is a belief in separation. And I wholeheartedly agree with this, and I want to take you through applying this framework to explain why that one belief in separation then leads to where we're at the moment. So, this notion of separation, that I am separate from everyone and everything else, has been around for a very long time. I think it's a product of ancestral trauma. I can only speculate as to at what point in human history or even social primate history. So, what do we mean by separation? Okay, we mean not being a part of all that is. In an esoteric sense, this would then lean us towards non-dual philosophies. It also makes us think about deep ecology and being part of ecosystems. And a certain amount of separation is obviously an evolutionary benefit, because I think it was Terence McKenna who once put it, if all was one and we perceived it as such at all times, we wouldn't know whose mouth to put the spoon in when we're at the dinner party. So there's a certain degree of utility in separation. The whole creation of the ego has utility for survival, and that is the creation of this separate self. Even though it's an illusion, it has utility. So we've got this tension between everything being one and then the utility of separation. But it can and has, I would argue, been maladaptive. And how is that? Right, okay, so let's take this belief in separation. We're separate from nature. We're somehow made and put here. We are separate from each other. We're all atomized individuals. And we are separate and alone cosmically and metaphysically, which then creates narratives, right? So if we believe in that separation, if we believe that we are not whole, not integral, not collective, not together, what happens? Okay, well, the narratives that come out of that: number one, lack, not enough. If we believe in separation from nature, from people, from all that is, there's this belief then, this narrative then of lack. I am not enough. I am insufficient. I need to be complete. I am not already complete. What are the feelings that come from that? Well, depression, self-loathing, grief, loneliness, hopelessness, bitterness, disappointment, rejection. You can think about this separation as the ego, or you can think about this as just separation from nature or from anything. The story of not being enough then creates those feelings of sadness, and the survival behavior that would then kick in to meet those unmet needs and try to take us to a state where we feel that those needs are being met by, instead of going within and changing how we are seeing the world and thinking about it, instead looking outside, external to us, and say, well, I'm not enough. Therefore, what behaviors can I do out there in the world to change that? I can extract, I can take. This is where greed comes in, and growth, because the alternative, if you believe that your inner world can only be affected by what's going on outside of you, if you believe that your experience is conditional on your circumstances, then you're going to look at the circumstances and try and take. Otherwise, you're going to give up. And we wouldn't be here if those ancestors had given up. Okay, next narrative that comes out of separation: attachment. If I believe in separation and I have stories of lack, then what happens next is I start looking outside of me, as I just said, about taking, about extracting, which then means that all these things outside of me become very, very important to me. My happiness becomes conditional on external actors and events. And this is where this victimhood consciousness comes around. If only they would do this. If only I had this, then I would be happy, then I would be content. Just jumping back into this quick cut, this is also where violence comes from. So if we believe that the external conditions have to be met in order for us to feel that our needs are being met and that we're okay, then woe betide anyone or anything that gets in the way of that happening. So we're putting all this value in something that's external to us, and that thing has to happen in order for us to feel good. So if someone gets in the way of that, they're preventing us from our happiness, and then we are feeling hatred, envy, resentment, frustration, irritation, anger. This is violence. And just as a note, I think exploitation here, that's part of it, but really it's violence. And then the exploitation bit leads into domination, which is coming up next. But back to the video. And the feelings that come about from this hatred, envy, resentment, frustration, irritation, because you don't have the ability to affect the changes that you want. And we're looking outside of ourselves to meet these unmet needs. And this is where attachment comes from. Suddenly we start imbuing external things with all this power over how they make us feel. So we end up in a space where if I'm lacking and I need something to complete me, then I need to go and find those things outside of me, attach them to me so that they are mine, and I can feel good, which then brings this behaviour of exploitation. If only these people would do this, then I'd be okay. Okay, well, I'm going to make them do that. So we've got extraction, now we've got exploitation through the manipulation and control of other people, which, if we believe that our needs can only be met by external actors and things behaving in such ways to meet our needs for us, and we therefore exploit them in order for them to meet our needs, and our happiness is conditional, then it makes sense that the next narrative is to control as much as possible. Because if our happiness is conditional on all those things around us, those people and those events, in order to meet our needs, then we must control them. Because if we are in that situation and we believe it to be true, if we don't have control, then we're left with fear. And this is why so many right-wing parties push fear and scaremongering to then offer control, because it's that immediate antidote to it. If we are in a state of fear, it is a state of not being in control. We have these unmet needs in us that make us feel stressed and worried and anxious. They bring panic and paranoia. So what's the behaviour that comes from that? Domination, control. So effectively, what I'm trying to argue here is that if we look at the lenses of belief, the narratives that come from them, the emotional responses that we have from that, and then the behaviours that come from it, we can see that belief in separation leads us to narratives of lack, of attachment and of control, which manifest then in sadness, in anger and in fear, unless we take actions of extraction, exploitation and domination in order to externally change how we feel inside. But obviously the easier answer is to look inside and find that belief and go, is it true? Do I need that belief? Is my belief in separation valid? And if anything, the 20th century has shown us through the progression in our understanding of cosmic evolution, of quantum physics, of ecology, nothing is separate. The rise of Gaia theory, of Earth system science, of just so much of the 20th century in terms of a Western lens has come to the conclusion that nothing is separate. Everything is an emergence in a quantum field. Everything is fundamentally entangled. All life comes from this one single origin. Every single atom in my body was forged in a star. Like, everything is completely interdependent, interconnected, and nothing is separate. Nothing. When we look at chaos theory, complexity theory, and so on, we see how these little ripples go out through all things, how everything is absolutely fundamentally not separate. But that understanding hasn't cascaded through our narratives yet, through our culture. It's not there yet, so the behaviours are still the same. So what does this mean? Okay, so are we all of a sudden going to be able to solve the Metacrisis by identifying this belief in separation and then, hey, everything's sweet? No. These things take time. Cultural change, social transformation, personal transformation. What we're essentially talking about here is healing ancestral trauma. Okay? Now, for those of you that hear that and resonate with that, great. But the vast majority of people will not. This is a story of a species, an ecological overshoot. It's playing out. And our culture in the West, with this belief in separation, it's playing out. Until we heal, until we therefore transform, things will take a long time to change, I think. But that's not to be doomist, but to appreciate that healing takes time and that it is done by invitation. And therefore, I suppose what I'm trying to say is, don't try and force healing on anybody in order to make yourself feel better. Heal yourself. Your healing, your transformation, your personal transformation is social transformation. And the brighter you shine, the more light you put out onto everyone else to do the same. And I think, as Wendell Berry said, we have to be patient in an emergency. So let's just acknowledge this and let's remember who and what we are. Let's apologize to all the other cultures outside of Western culture who know this and have been saying this for years, for whom it's been an essential part of their culture and their beliefs and their narratives and their stories, and recognize that they're right. That those understandings and narratives where we don't maintain this belief in separation have a much healthier and more connected alignment with nature, with the laws of the natural world, and with ecosystems and with the planet, and therefore potentially with physics and the universe as well. We may see those narratives and find them odd, but if we look to find the beliefs within them, if we look to find the meaning inside them and how that makes us feel, and the behaviours that those narratives and beliefs then create, then we can see their worth and start to ask ourselves, well, how do we change? How do we change our stories so that we're no longer maintaining this belief in separation? How do we find new ways of seeing the world? How do we dislodge that old trauma and that old belief in separation? How do we honour it and thank it for the whole reason it's there is to keep us alive, but we no longer need it because we see that maintaining it is only going to cause us more harm. And then how do we tell new stories? How do we find new ways of making meaning in the world that bring us back into more union and less separation, more connection, more understanding, more embeddedness? How do we tell stories that mirror that entanglement and that interconnection and interdependence and celebrate it? And in so doing, remind ourselves of who and what we really are. What does that kind of culture look like? So I'll leave it there. If this is interesting in any way, by all means, hit like, subscribe so the algorithm shows you more. And otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye.